For most people who feel like they're too busy, or it seems like even more work to get a process in place like what you teach, how do you usually respond when it feels like it's too much work to even get organized?
Yeah, what I would point to is I think there's a mindset shift. There's always a mindset shift to undergo, right? Uh, which is actually the mindset shift that I think a lot of people need to go through, especially a lot of Americans, a lot of Western people, a lot of people in developed countries. I think we have this built-in bias that order is better, that more order is inherently superior, which is just not true. I'm reading a book right now called A Perfect Mess. The whole book is just examples and evidence and proof that in many, not just a few situations, most situations, too much order can be just as detrimental and just as bad as too little. And so instead of thinking, okay, more order is better, being organized is always preferable, always a good idea, you should always invest more time in being organized. I almost think of organization as it's like a special substance. It's like a magical elixir that I have this tiny little vial of it. And there are just these very few parts of my life, just a handful where I can sort of open up the elixir and add a little bit of order to make it better. But that there's actually not many parts of my life like that. And even for those parts, it's not a lot of organization that's needed, just a little bit, right? So we can get into what some of those areas are. But I would encourage people to think of order and chaos as just two sides to the coin, kind of like yin and yang. And it's really about the balance between those two things, not assuming that one is always better than the other.
That's very interesting, and I can't help but make a parallel to, a lot of the themes that would come up from works of Jordan Peterson, who speaks a lot about order and chaos when it comes to psychology, the concept like growing up, taking on responsibility, and I think even having it associated quite strongly to the masculine trait of order and the feminine trait of chaos, but also parallel towards creation. Do you find the concepts of organizing your digital life or even just your projects and your way of operating and working follows around those same guidelines?
Yeah, and I think they definitely do. And where this comes from me is for me is the fact that my dad is American and my mom is Brazilian. And so when I say American, I know what the American, there's a kind of attitude and worldview, which is related to the attitude of the whole kind of Western world. But then there's a Brazilian lens. There's a Brazilian perspective and way of being. And I kind of see the world through that lens as well. And the Brazilian mode, the Brazilian lens is far more fluid. I can always contrast the American way of seeing things and the Brazilian way of seeing things. The American way will be much more rigid, much more engineered and structured and kind of formulaic, systematic, whereas the Brazilian, and to be clear, there's many situations where that is a powerful perspective, right? There are many situations where you want to be that way. But there are many where that doesn't work and where you need to be more organic, more fluid, more natural, more reactive, more spontaneous. And that is where the Brazilian lens is so powerful. And I feel like a lot of my way of doing knowledge management, the way I think of second brains, comes from the interplay of these two perspectives, which are exactly what you said, order and chaos, right? Structure and contents, left brain and right brain. We have all these dualities that we're familiar with that I think also manifest themselves when it comes to organizing.
Wow. Well, okay, I have one of these friends, right? And actually, I think he's a mutual friend. His name's Eric. And he is somebody who is absolutely obsessed with bringing absolute order into his notes, into his projects, into the way that he kind of structures his information. But I also seem to witness in him a sort of stuckness about it. And it's like the projects don't actually move forward because it's spending all your time in just trying to organize. And if I think of more common examples, I feel like one of the ways this maybe manifests is when I have a ton of emails and I'll spend like an entire day just clearing emails, but I haven't done anything. Would that be examples of what happens if you're only leaning on the order pillar?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. That's actually a great example because you think about so much of the productivity world is about like routines and habits, right? You get up at 5 a.m., you or 4 a.m. or whatever it is these days. You have, these five things you do, and then at this time you do that, and you drink this many cups of water and all these things. And there are seasons, there are periods where that is necessary. That's your your environment. That's the basic set of habits that keep you healthy and grounded and sane and productive. But it's interesting because I don't know about you, but there's been these moments in my life where usually when a big opportunity has arisen, right? A potential client conversation, someone, you could work for, or someone wants to hire you, or someone wants to invite you on their podcast, or there's some big opportunity. When such an opportunity presents itself, you have to just be able to let go of everything. Just let go, like at the drop of a hat, of all the structure and the routine and the rules, right? You don't want to like be in the middle of a conversation. You're about to land a huge client and you're like, oh no, sorry, it's 4:30 p.m. I have to go to the gym because it's on my habit checklist. They'll be like, what the hell? Right? So in a funny way, the ability to let go of your routines and then come back to them quickly is to me just as important as the ability to stick with your routines, perfectly.
That's so interesting you say that because yeah, I've followed the method where it's like time blocking, right? Like make sure my calendar represents what I actually do. And there seems to be kind of this natural degradation of that habit. And it seems different than what you're speaking about. Like I've had those opportunities where something incredible happens and then it's like it makes sense for me to kind of consciously cancel the plans, rewrite everything and change my priorities. But what actually bothers me more is this natural decay of some of these habits and order that I have, which seems to just drag me slowly but surely towards a little more chaos. And there's a part of me that's trying to find what is the elixir or the antidote to either slow that down or completely stop it, which I would assume is impossible. But there's ways that I feel like I want to be better at catching myself when there's a slow slip into chaos.
So here's the antidote that I would offer, which is to embrace it. That what you're describing as decay, right? The decay of the habit, I would describe a different way, which is the habit initially is a scaffolding. It's like a skeleton that you need this very rigid, very strong structure to learn a new behavior. But as you do it and as you get familiar with it, it becomes internalized. It sinks into your nervous system. It becomes a part of who you are and how you're thinking to such a degree that you no longer need the original habit at all.
I know why you talked about mindset change first now, because there's a part of me that's finding that very hard to accept. I'll be honest, Tiago, I'm hearing this and I'm just like, no, that means like I'm a bad person and I'm failing. And I feel like most systems around teaching me to be productive would agree to that. And you're coming in from a really different perspective. So when you share ideas like that, does the community around productivity teachings kind of like scoff at what you share? Or is it something that, underlying what they teach is the ultimate objective?
Yeah, I think so there's a distinction here, which is beginner and advanced ideas, right? If I'm talking to someone who's a beginner, right? And by beginner, that could be age, they're young, or it could mean just their familiarity with these concepts and ideas, like they've just, read their first book on personal development, or beginner in terms of something they're trying to achieve. Let's say they, I don't know, just had a kid, and so they're a beginner at being a parent. So a beginner in any sense, there are certain beginner ideas that are oversimplifications, but they're still necessary for beginners, right? But then when you're no longer a beginner, according to any of those definitions, there are other advanced ideas that are more subtle, they're more sophisticated, they're more complex, and you need that beginner foundation to even appreciate them. But at some point or another, it's actually important for you psychologically to graduate from the beginner concepts to the more advanced ones. And what I just described is definitely an advanced one. I wouldn't go talking to a college student, be like, habits are not important. Forget all structure. Free your mind. I would be like, no, you need to learn how to just get up early in the morning, work out every day, do your homework, right? But because it's you and you have the background that you have, we are able to talk about those higher order things.
I think that nuance about information geared towards beginners versus advanced is one of the most missed lenses of filtering information that comes at you over the internet. And
Yes.
we go to YouTube to find these types of advice. And I think that the areas that get affected the most negatively are actually in the fields of spirituality, where when you
Mm.
take an advanced concept, it can have some really bad consequences if you're coming in with a beginner's mind. Luckily, we're not dealing with life and death as much here, and we're talking about productivity. But given that you're on the Selling with Love podcast, I can't help but make the parallel to when I tell people follow the script, just make like 10 prospecting calls a day. And I'm giving this very prescriptive stuff so that people get into the habit and develop a kind of muscle so that they can become more comfortable with sales. And I'm seeing that there's also a very good parallel here when it comes to productivity. Thank you so much for listening to the Selling with Love podcast. We have some previous episodes you can tune into right here. And if you prefer the short form content where you get to the point in under 10 minutes, we do have a ton of clips from our best episodes that are being shared on this channel as well. So pick which one supports you the most. And of course, thank you for liking, subscribing, and of course, selling with love.